Episode 3. The Battlefield. It was getting cold and the wind was blowing. Caleb was not quite awake, but he felt the cold as if it were going to sink into his bones. Inside the restaurant, Crystal was now awake. Her eyes were focused on the shadowy figures outside, as if she was facing a formidable enemy. Warren had just woken up not long ago, sweat covering his forehead as he shook the sleeping Caleb and said in a low voice,
"Kid, wake up."
"What is it?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse from sleep.
"Don't talk. It's a bug tide. It's dangerous."
"What is a bug tide?" Caleb wondered. Before Caleb could ask, Warren lowered his voice to a whisper and explained the situation. The bug tide was the name for the large-scale migration of the mutated animals after they encountered a large dose of nuclear radiation. And they were coming this way. The team had stopped moving, not daring to make any noise. The gray torrents in the darkness became stronger and stronger. It was like a surging river of creatures, making a cacophony of squeaking sounds. It was only now that Caleb realized he still had the same continuous tearing headache from the day before. He turned his eyes to the dark silhouette outside the AMA. How could this be considered a bug? Its body was as big as that of a large dog. Several limbs that were covered in fur extended from its abdomen. As Caleb watched, the limbs dug deep holes in the ground. 3 pairs of compound eyes rotated densely on its head. They seemed to penetrate through the gray fog and flickered with a dark green light. But there wasn't just one. There were hundreds. They stacked on top of each other, crushing all obstacles in the way with the huge mouth parts of their heads and the limbs covered in sharp bristles. Sometimes they would even kill their own kind in sudden rage, dismembering their bodies and flinging the limbs aside, continuing forward with the drying blood covering their bodies. The bugs were hideous, evil things. The appearance of the bugs lasted for almost half an hour before the gray tide slowly faded, leaving the team's chests rising and falling, along with their heart rates. Afterward, it was as though they had been in a life-or-death battle, even though they had ridden out this particular bug tide without firing a shot. "Why would there be a bug tide here in the city?" Caleb asked. No one answered. "Let's follow them," Crystal said. Caleb looked at her in disbelief. Crystal's expression was veiled as usual. Her beautiful eyes shone, but he wondered if she had lost her mind.
"Forget it,"
Warren began. But before Warren could finish speaking, Caleb cut in. "Is it worth it?" Caleb had read the basic information about the bug horde. Most of the time it happened in primitive areas where human activity was relatively rare. Now that it was in the city, it meant that something had changed. But what? It was a piece of information that had not been disclosed by other alpha hunters. It was extremely valuable information, and it might be worth a lot of money. Caleb looked at Crystal. She nodded. "It could be worth a lot," she confirmed. As an experienced alpha hunter, Warren naturally understood the reason behind Crystal's suggestion. But just now, he was thinking that Caleb was a rookie, and that it would be too dangerous. That was why he wanted to retreat. But now, Caleb and Crystal had agreed. Warren shrugged and turned around to sit in the armored car's driver's seat.
"We can't get too close or turn on the searchlights,"
he reminded them.
"That will expose our position and cause us to be attacked." "Crystal, are you sure about this?"
She fixed him with a look that answered his question.
"Well then, you lead the way."
Warren started the armored car and followed the bug tide at a slow pace in the dark. The mutated creatures swept nearly everything out of the way in their path, plodding onward and leaving an uneven road that was much flattened. Caleb did not know if it was because of the nanotechnology suit, but Crystal had excellent night vision. Even without any light source, she could clearly distinguish any obstacle on the road. From time to time, she would give out warnings to avoid an errant piece of metal or mangled bug carcass. Caleb was surprised by the solid relationship he saw between Warren and Crystal. Although Uncle Warren was concerned about the younger man's safety on this mission, he also trusted Crystal completely. When Crystal called out a warning or an order, Warren did not hesitate to comply without asking questions. Caleb could not help but feel admiration for both of them in his heart. The road was still bumpy. After driving at speed for more than 10 minutes to catch up, Warren gradually slowed down the AMA. Less than 500 meters ahead, Caleb saw several mutants that were the size of horses, trailing at the end of the bug horde. "That's gotta be the edge of Area C!" he exclaimed, taking in the landscape. Caleb had a good sense of direction and a good memory. He quickly compared the projection in his temporary camp tent with the building next to him and discerned the likely destination of the bug horde. "Left, 2 meters, Crystal said. Warren twisted the wheel slightly to avoid the collapsed road in front of him. They continued to follow the bug tide. "Should we enter the city? There's no way we have enough supplies to stay here for long. What about—" Just when Caleb trailed off, Crystal interrupted him. "It's worth the risk. We'll probably find a rare element or creature." So that was the goal. After Crystal's reminder, Caleb came to the realization that the nuclear war not only wiped out all the creatures in the area, but also gave birth to many new elements in the thermonuclear effect that humans could not create in the old era. After the modification and fusion of the same abnormally violent atmosphere, these new elements gathered on the ground. They were devoured by the creatures, who then evolved. They gathered at a certain place and evolved into strange mutations. Whether it was creatures or substances, they were the rarest resources, and the scarcity of those resources meant that they were worth a lot of money. Caleb's black eyes lit up, but quickly dimmed. No matter how high the value, he would only get a small cut of the final take. But maybe even a small cut of a large sum would be worth it. As they went deeper into the city, the obstacles on the street became denser. Crystal and Warren had to be even more careful guiding the AMA, and it was silent inside the armor vehicle. They couldn't afford to be distracted. Suddenly, through the rear-view mirror, Caleb saw a few armored vehicles appear at the intersection that they had just passed. They gathered into a convoy and followed behind the AMA. Just as Caleb was about to report the situation, an alert tone suddenly rang out from the communication device on the armored vehicle. After a few flashes, it became a language that could be understood.
"Unidentified vehicle. Which mission sector are you authorized for?"
The voice carried an unspoken threat. The three of them looked at each other. Caleb keyed the communication device and answered,
"A2. This is Lieutenant Sims. Pull over and fall back. We will take over command in this sector." "Understood,"
Caleb answered. Warren and Crystal heaved a heavy sigh of relief at the same time. Alpha hunters were good and bad. They sometimes killed one another. There were times when some people surpassed their value. Warren steered the AMA to the side of the road. The armored cars behind them quickly and covertly flashed their lights twice and gradually accelerated. They passed the AMA and became the leader of the convoy. The radio cracked again.
"Follow behind us. Maintain the distance and wait for reinforcements." "Understood,"
Caleb repeated. Warren and Crystal, who were no longer tensed up, let out a sigh of relief. But at this moment, the bug tide gradually slowed down until it stopped in place. It was eerily quiet for a moment. Then, with a deafening sound that pierced through their eardrums, a dark red pillar of light exploded from the center of the insect tide. It rushed into the clouds, setting off a huge shockwave that caused the rain to suddenly stop. After that, it resumed pattering on the windshield of the AMA. No one knew what the pillar of light was, or at least no one had time to explain it to Caleb. Both the Bugtide and the convoy were damaged by the violent aftershocks of the explosions. Neighboring buildings were also damaged, and large chunks of metal and concrete began to rain down on the unlucky ground level. Before Caleb could recover from his dizziness, Warren's voice rang in his ears.
"Danger!"
Warren shouted.
"Don't freeze up on me!"
Directly in front of him, a sharp mutated limb covered in bristles pierced through the metal wall of the AMA, attacking them. Gunfire rang out. Fiery red spots sprayed residue on Caleb's helmet. With a loud crash, one of the largest bugs smashed into the thick steel plate of the armored vehicle, creating a huge hole in the side. The AMA tipped over, throwing Caleb and Warren against the side of the interior cab. At the same time, they kicked at the creature's limbs, crushing them, and the mutated creature was pushed a few meters back to regroup. Caleb drew back from the edge of blacking out. Warren's wrinkled face emerged in his line of sight. His lips opened and closed, but Caleb could hear nothing but a dull, ringing sound. Warren picked up and shoved his loaded rifle into Caleb's shaking hand, stock first. Almost subconsciously, Caleb fingered the safety, pulled the trigger on full auto, and hit the deck. Caleb, who had been hit by the creature's wild thrashing limbs twice in a row, had no idea when Warren got out of the AMA, or when he broke the door of the passenger seat and pulled himself out of the overturned armor vehicle. His only thought was survival. Fire was exploding everywhere, and the sound in his ears was gradually returning. "All teams," a voice boomed. "Rally to me and form a defensive line." The situation was critical, and Lieutenant Sims took charge. He activated the internal communication system of his power suit and established a temporary command pod. Warren leaned against Caleb's back, panting heavily. He asked anxiously,
"Are you hurt?"
Except for the ringing in his ears caused by a concussion, Caleb did not find any wounds after a quick check, except for a few bumps on the power suit.
"Then reload and follow Crystal. Let's go."
At the same time, Crystal was standing at the back of the armored vehicle, taking cover and firing accelerated shots from the large-caliber handgun she carried. She had single-handedly created an escape route through the ambush, and now she surged toward it. Warren did not hesitate. He raised his rifle in his hands and started to mow down the mutated creatures that had tried to block the three of them again. With his other hand, he pushed Caleb forward. Due to his nervousness, it took Caleb 3 tries to seat the magazine in his rifle properly. He fired 3 shots, adding to the effectiveness of Crystal and Warren's firepower. At the same time, his footsteps sped up a little. The sudden encounter caused both sides to suffer great losses. For a moment, the communication channel was drowned out by wails and cries for help and explosions. However, most of them died without a sound. War was cruel. There was a momentary break in the engagement. Caleb's stomach was churning violently as he looked at the corpses that covered the road and the oddly colorful internal organs of the mutants that dyed the gray ground.
"Look out!"
The sharp sound of the creatures resumed without any warning. It was the loudest set of chirps imaginable, drowning out every other thought and breaking Caleb's concentration. In intense pain, Caleb subconsciously pulled the trigger. Crystal grabbed the raised muzzle of his rifle and pushed it to the side. "Watch your target!" she screamed. He had nearly hit her with friendly fire. The radio crackled inside Caleb's helmet. There was much too feedback.
"Be careful. Reinforce. Insect King."
The communication cut out, silencing Lieutenant Sims' commands. Suddenly, Caleb saw Crystal's body swerve quickly to the right and drop to the ground. A horribly hairy bug limb had just missed her, stabbing diagonally toward her back. Without a plan, Caleb suddenly took a step forward and pounced onto the limb, twisting it against the joint with all of his strength. At the same time, Crystal fell to the ground, and the mutant creature's sneak attack missed. Seeing this, Warren immediately pulled out his gun with his right hand and shot the monstrous creature into a mist of gore. Caleb breathed out in relief. Crystal gave him a quick thumbs up and went back to firing her gun. However, the sound of gunfire was gradually weakening. This was not a good sign. Leaning against the armored vehicle that was now on fire, Caleb felt the strange allure of death. He understood now how a man could panic and rush into a fatal encounter, and he didn't like that feeling. His throat felt like it was being pressed by a sharp blade, and he could die at any time. Now, he heard a low, ominous rumble. After all of the destruction, Caleb watched as a tall building just ahead of him collapsed from the middle, and shattered stones flew everywhere, causing the already sparse gunshots to become silent. Amongst the falling rocks, many mutated creatures were caught in the hailstorm. They were crushed into mincemeat by the careening rocks. The flying dust extinguished the fire on the armored vehicles, causing the surroundings to once again sink into darkness. Everything had gone silent. Crystal, Warren, and Caleb were crouched behind a concrete barrier. Among the three of them, Crystal seemed to be the only one who was still calm in the darkness. Caleb broke the silence first. His voice was trembling, and his nasal voice was heavy. "What should we do?" The three of them looked at each other. They were leaning against the slightly hot armored vehicle, but no one answered. The dust settled slowly. Caleb poked his head around an outside corner and saw a pair of huge wings in the gray fog. Under the worship of many mutated creatures, they fluttered up. "It's the Insect King," Caleb pointed. Between the wings, green eyes that were like glowing beacons turned and surveyed the destruction from the distant sky. In an instant, Caleb's body stiffened as if he had been injected with lead and became numb. He heard a loud chirp. It was the signal issued by the Insect King to charge. Their target was Caleb.
Run!
Warren roared in fear. He abandoned Caleb, who was still in the same spot, and madly moved his legs. Next to Caleb, Crystal remained expressionless. She pushed the loaded magazine back into her pistol and put it on the hood of the armored car, firing one accurate shot after another. However, the bullets were drowned out in the flood of noise. The radio crackled in Caleb's helmet. It was an unfamiliar new voice.
Is anyone there? Answer if you can hear me. This is Jeremy Narson.
Jeremy Narson was the leader of Western California, a sort of celebrity. What's he doing here? Caleb wondered. But he didn't have time to consider that for long. An engine roared above them in the sky, but Caleb could not make out who or what was flying there. Warren emerged from a ruined alleyway and ran toward them, eyes wide in terror. Hundreds of bugs were converging on their position. Caleb realized that it was probably the end. Stopping just before the concrete barrier, Warren pulled out all the grenades at his waist, opened the latches, and threw them at the bug horde. He then leaped over the barrier, shielding Caleb from the inevitable blast. Caleb waited for the explosion, but it didn't come. The grenades were markers for air support, firing orange flares high into the air that marked the enemy position. After a few breaths, a dense cluster of missiles fell from the sky and created a layer of steam due to the high temperature in the rain. Caleb and his team were thrown clear in the third explosion. They fell heavily to the ground. Before he lost consciousness, the last thing Caleb saw was a spiderweb crack spreading across his helmet visor. Then, everything went black.